Hi, I'm Bob, and welcome to Bob's Movie Facts. Space, the final frontier. But in 1989, it wasn't just Captain Kirk boldly going where no man had gone before. It was William Shatner himself stepping behind the camera to direct the most infamous, most debated, and most misunderstood Star Trek film ever.
Share your pain with me.
Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is a movie where Spock flies around in rocket boots, where Uhura does a sexy desert fan dance, where the Enterprise barely works and the crew literally goes searching for God at the center of the galaxy. It's wild, it's messy, it's ambitious, and it's one of the most fascinating production stories in sci-fi history. In this video, we're diving into the chaos, the creativity, the budget problems, and the studio interference, as well as behind-the-scene mishaps, the lost special effects, and the big beating heart at the center of Shatner's cosmic quest. Whether you love it, hate it, or secretly defend it at conventions, Star Trek V remains a cinematic anomaly, part passion project, part disaster, and all legend. So set your phasers on stun, strap into your malfunctioning shuttlecraft, and join me as we explore how The Final Frontier became one of the most talked about films in the entire Star Trek universe. Here are top 10 mind-blowing facts about Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. Fact number 1, Shatner and Nimoy had a favored nations clause in their 1966 contract that led to Shatner directing this film. With the massive success of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, a fifth Star Trek film was inevitable. However, according to the contract that William Shatner signed, Shatner had the right to direct Star Trek V, and he accepted the job. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy had a favored nations clause in their contracts from the original Star Trek series, ensuring equal perks like pay raises or script control. The clause meant that if one actor received a raise, the other would get a raise. And if one actor got a directorial opportunity, the other got the same. And after Leonard Nimoy directed Star Trek III, the studios had to offer William Shatner the right to direct Star Trek IV, which he declined. However, after Leonard Nimoy directed III and IV, Shatner finally offered to direct V. Now, this was not a surprising decision at that time. William Shatner had successfully directed many episodes of T.J. Hooker, and so the Paramount executives had confidence in Shatner. Shatner also came up with a story idea, and he got his inspiration from watching televangelists. Shatner said that these televangelists were repulsive, strangely horrifying, and yet I became absolutely fascinated. Now remember, this was 1987, and televangelists were heavy in the news. In 1987, Pastor Jim Bakker was accused of sexual misconduct with his church secretary, Jessica Hahn, and in 1988, Jimmy Swaggart had his own scandals. William Shatner began writing the story of his first draft, which was called Star Trek V: The Act of Love. In the first draft of the story, a televangelist character named Czar would kidnap a human, a Klingon, and a Romulan ambassador who were living on a failed paradise planet. Kirk and the Enterprise would go to help, but get overwhelmed by Czar's superior forces, and Spock and McCoy and the rest of the Enterprise crew would get brainwashed by Czar to believe that he was divine. Czar would reveal that he is on a quest to meet God, and Kirk would pretend to follow Czar and travel with him to the God planet, which would be a fiery wasteland. Kirk confronts God, who turns into Satan, and Spock and McCoy would split up in order to escape, but Spock would get captured, and Kirk would go back to rescue Spock from going to hell. However, Harve Bennett worried about making a movie about the existence of God. I mean, this is such a huge topic that you are bound to leave the audience unsatisfied. At best, it was too weighty, and at worst, it could be offensive. Bennett believed that a Star Trek story about God is not really fun, but a story about an alien that thinks it is God could be potentially exciting. Bennett and Shatner changed the God character into an alien pretending to be God. Now, for a screenwriter, they first approached Nicholas Meyer, but when he found out that the story would be about the Enterprise meeting God, he declined. Then Bennett showed William Shatner a screenplay by David Loughery, and Shatner was impressed and hired him. Fact number 2, Shatner and Loughery wanted Sybok to be played by Sean Connery. In later drafts, the character of Czar was changed to Sybok, and while writing him, they wanted him to be played by one actor, Sean Connery. And that would have been amazing. You can almost picture him in this movie. Well, they tried to pursue Connery, but apparently they didn't even get close. Apparently, they didn't even get so much as a phone call with him. Besides, Sean Connery was busy making Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Later, the planet named Sha Ka Ree was a pun on Sean Connery. They then considered Max von Sydow, but apparently that also went nowhere. And I have to admit, I can also picture Max von Sydow in this movie. Fact number 3, Shatner's original story was much darker and pitted Kirk against the entire crew. Now, it should also be noted that in the original draft of the screenplay, the character of Tsar was much more of a ruthless leader who demanded absolute loyalty from his cult. However, the producers worried that his character resembled too much of the character of Khan Noonien Singh. And so, to understand the original vision that William Shatner and David Loughery had for this movie, we can imagine a character similar to Khan taking over the ship and crew. And that is pretty cool. Also, the original concept for the movie was much more serious and much darker, and it didn't have all the jokes that have now become associated with Star Trek V. The humor itself was mandated by the studio, who felt that Star Trek IV was funny and extremely successful. So in order to be as successful, Star Trek V had to be just as funny.
Yes. We've been caught in a blizzard.
Hence, they made the crew put in a lot of the humor. So William Shatner and David Loughery had to add in a lot of the jokes to their original serious concept.
What's the matter, Jim? I miss my old chair.
In the original script, Spock and McCoy also get brainwashed by Sybok and join his cause. This would pit Captain Kirk all alone on the Enterprise fighting Sybok by himself, who now had Spock on his side against him. Yes, this is a testament to William Shatner's ego, but you can't deny that it would have been a very dramatic story. One man all alone against his entire crew? The audience would wonder, how can Kirk get out of this? And sure enough, people who read the original script have said that the story was much stronger than what we got on screen. Fact number 4, Shatner saw Luckenbill on late night TV playing Lyndon Johnson and hired him for Sybok. One day, William Shatner was at home watching TV and saw a play called Lyndon, starring Lawrence Luckenbill, and when Shatner saw him, he said, "That's my guy for Sybok." And Lawrence Luckenbill had a strong stage presence and excellent acting skills. And it also didn't hurt that he looked a little bit like Sean Connery. Lawrence Luckenbill was a professional stage actor and was well respected in Hollywood. He was also the husband of Lucy Arnaz, the daughter of legendary couple Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. And it was Lucille Ball who helped greenlight the original Star Trek back in 1966. Fact number 5, Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley refused to do a movie where Spock and McCoy betray Kirk. Now, the movie would start with Kirk, McCoy, and Spock together on a camping trip, and this was one of the first scenes that Shatner and Loughery wrote and was in the first draft of the screenplay. And Shatner felt that the scene was the heart of the entire movie. These are 3 men approaching late life. None of the 3 are married, they have no children, and they have no prospects for love. They have sacrificed their love for the mission and have spent their entire lives together. And all they had was their friendship. And Shatner loved the scene and loved how Nimoy and Kelley acted the scene with him. And he felt that it captured the chemistry of their friendship for the entire Star Trek saga.
Merrily, 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 lightly down the stream. Merrily, 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 light. Come on, why didn't you jump in?
I was trying to comprehend the meaning of the words. It's a song, you green-blooded Vulcan.
Now, when William Shatner presented his screenplay, both Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley objected to the script. They both felt that Spock and McCoy would never betray Kirk. They refused to be in the movie unless the script was changed, so William Shatner rewrote the story where Spock and McCoy stand by Kirk's side against Sybok. So now you have the 2 refusing to betray Kirk, but it's now 3 heroes against 1 villain, rather than Kirk fighting him all by himself. And while this is probably more true to the character of Spock and McCoy, it is less satisfying dramatically. Suddenly the villain doesn't seem so dangerous, and there's now never a moment where you wonder what Kirk is going to do next. It diluted the story. So without Kirk fighting the entire Enterprise by himself, you're left with a very passive story where you have our Enterprise crew passively going along on Sybok's quest. It weakened the story. Also, there's a question whether Sybok is a villain or an ally. For the first half of the movie, he is the antagonist, and we the audience are rooting against him. However, we never really quite root against him, because Lawrence Luckenbill plays Sybok with such nobility that he never comes across as villainous. I think that's a detriment from a dramatic point of view. Halfway through the movie, he becomes part of the crew. all aspects of him being the villain are dropped. We're suddenly introduced to a whole new villain, this godlike alien being that had never been properly set up and suddenly appears during the last minutes of the movie. Fact number 6. The idea of Spock and Sybok being brothers was shoehorned in at the last minute.
Sybok couldn't possibly be your brother because I happen to know for a fact you don't have a brother.
In the original script, Spock was not related to Sybok, but simply a Vulcan that Spock admired. However, Leonard Nimoy did not believe that Spock would betray Kirk. He would have just shot Sybok without hesitation in order to disarm him and save the Enterprise. Only a few movies ago, Spock did not hesitate to sacrifice his life to save the ship. Since then, Kirk risked his career, lost his rank, lost his own son, lost his ship in order to rescue Spock. So why would Spock betray Captain Kirk and the whole Enterprise crew now, just for this unknown character? It didn't make much sense. As a solution, they decided to buff up the relationship and make Sybok, Spock's half-brother, to make it a little more believable that he wouldn't shoot him. Well, there were several problems with this addition into Star Trek canon. First, it seemed entirely unbelievable that Spock's father, Sarek, was married before. It was even more unbelievable that Sarek had fathered another child. And if so, why didn't Spock ever mention him? Second, the problem was that the idea of Spock having a half-brother was never explored during the rest of the movie. This idea that Spock had a brother could have been a very interesting concept to pursue in the movie. However, once the half-brother device was used to explain why Spock wouldn't shoot Sybok, it was put away and never explored again. And that is just sloppy writing. Gene Roddenberry himself hated this movie and refused to accept that Sarek had another wife before Amanda and another son before Spock. Roddenberry proclaimed that this would eventually be wiped out from Star Trek canon. And you can argue that this was wiped out from Star Trek canon even before the movie was over. Fact number 7. The cast of Star Trek were worried about Shatner's ego if he directed the film. Chekhov actor Walter Koenig was very concerned about William Shatner directing this film, because he worried about Shatner changing his character in a way that suited him without regard to the actors. Koenig cited situations in the past where Shatner recommended character changes, and now as director, he would have the power to implement those changes. However, Koenig was shocked to discover that Shatner was a kind and generous director who was very easy to work with. Another Star Trek cast member who expressed concerns was Sulu actor George Takei. Takei and Shatner had a well-known feud and disliked each other.
And the horse you rode in on.
He originally turned down being in Star Trek V. However, Shatner was able to convince George Takei to sign on to his movie. As filming progressed, George Takei was pleasantly surprised how good a director Shatner was, and Takei stated that William Shatner maintained an enthusiastic and creative atmosphere on set. And he said, "Despite our sometimes strained personal history, I found working with Bill surprisingly pleasant." George Takei stated that he developed a new admiration for William Shatner during the filming of this movie. And this feeling was almost unanimous among the crew, with almost everyone stating that William Shatner was kind and generous and created high morale during the filming of Star Trek V. Now, one actor who was not impressed was Scotty actor James Doohan, who felt that William Shatner was an egomaniac and wasn't capable of making a good Star Trek movie. Still, most of the cast had a great time with William Shatner in the director's chair. It appears that William Shatner was an excellent actor's director. Shatner's weaknesses was more in managing the business aspects of directing a large feature film. Fact number 8. The idea of Uhura's fan dance started as a joke. And for the scene where Uhura does a fan dance to distract Sybok's men in order to capture them, well, the idea started when screenwriter David Loughery joked to William Shatner and Harve Bennett that they should have Nichelle Nichols, who was 58 years old at the time and a few years shy of 60, to do a naked fan dance. And apparently this was intended to be a joke to make Shatner and Bennett laugh. Well, to David Loughery's shock, when he said it, they both paused and thought about it, and they both liked the idea, and Shatner said, "That's it." Remember, prior to Star Trek, the original series, Nichelle Nichols was a professional singer and dancer, and during the original series, she was a huge sex symbol. And Nichelle Nichols loved the scene. Contrary to the rumor, Nichelle Nichols was not naked and actually wore a skin-colored bathing suit. Well, she had a great time doing the scene, and originally, she even sang the song that Uhura sings. However, her singing was dubbed by another singer, and no one informed Nichols, who found out that her voice had been dubbed over during the premiere of the movie, and she was supposedly very upset when that happened. Now, for the scene where Scotty says, "I know this ship like the back of my hand," and then knocks himself out, James Doohan hated this scene and thought it made his character seem needlessly foolish. Doohan, who usually does the scene in one take, really struggled doing this short scene and apparently had to do the scene dozens and dozens of times before he got it right. Fact number 9, trying to save money on special effects ultimately ruined the movie. In order to save money, Shatner and his crew used much of the sets of Star Trek The Next Generation TV series. For example, the corridors, the sickbay were all used directly from the Next Generation set without any changes. The only thing they built from scratch was the new Enterprise bridge, which they'd hoped to use many more times, but unfortunately got to be used only one more time in Star Trek VI. However, despite these cost-saving measures, William Shatner admitted that due to his lack of experience, he spent too much money up front and eventually ran out of money for the final action piece. For special effects, William Shatner wanted Industrial Light and Magic, because ILM had done the special effects for Star Trek II, III, and IV. However, producers Harve, Bennett, and Ralph Winter learned that ILM already had 3 other major projects, and this meant that ILM's top team would be busy working on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Their B team would be working on Ghostbusters 2, and their C team would be working on James Cameron's The Abyss. Star Trek V would get ILM's D team. Ralph Winter and Harve Bennett realized that no one on this D team, the team that would have been assigned to Star Trek V, would have a single person who had worked on any of the previous Star Trek films. So in a fateful decision, Ralph Winter and Harve Bennett decided that this was a wonderful opportunity to save money. And Ralph Winter admitted that during this time, during the pre-production of Star Trek V,
and in hindsight, maybe he had too much exuberance and not enough discernment. Maybe we were smoking our own publicity.
with an air of invincibility, they believed that any other special effects company would be better than ILM's 4th-tier D team. Ralph Winter blames his decision not to use ILM as one of the reasons why this movie failed. Ralph Winter, Harve Bennett, and William Shatner met with many special effects companies, and Shatner chose Associates and Farron, headed by Bran Farron. And Associates and Farron had done the special effects for Little Shop of Horrors, Altered States, The Untouchables, and Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. And he was nominated for an Academy Award for Little Shop of Horrors. Bran Farron was considered an up-and-coming company known for practical effects. He had a good reputation in Hollywood for being creative and coming up with clever out-of-the-box solutions. However, it soon became apparent that this master of practical effects was a poor match for the special effects extravaganza such as Star Trek. And like Robert Abel with Star Trek The Motion Picture, Bran Farron had a lot of great ideas and made a lot of promises, but basically overpromised beyond his capabilities. For one, Bran Farron hated green screen and had never used it before, and it soon became obvious that you can't do a Star Trek movie without green screen. Therefore, Bran Farron had to subcontract another company, Gregory Jane Incorporated and Peter Wallach Enterprises, to do the green screen effects. The first problem came with filming the Enterprise itself, and this was a very fundamental and basic shot. ILM filmed the Enterprise for the last 3 movies, and in fact, if you consider that John Dykstra started Industrial Light and Magic, therefore there was 10 years and 4 films worth of continuity in filming the Enterprise. The same people developed new techniques and technologies over the 10-year span, and they'd turned it into a practiced art form. And suddenly, that team was gone. A whole new team who had never filmed the Enterprise before was expected to pick up where ILM took off. And Bran Farron's team struggled with even the most simple basic shots of the Enterprise, and that's why the shots of the Enterprise look stale and static. It practically looks amateurish in this movie. To further complicate the situation, when Bran Farron found the model of the Enterprise, he was shocked to see that someone had spray painted half the model in a dull matte gray. It happened between Star Trek IV and V when Universal Studios filmed an attraction called Star Trek Adventure, and during production, the Universal Studios team had difficulty filming the Enterprise due to the iridescent paint, and their quick solution was to paint it with a cheap matte gray colored spray paint, thus ruining this $100,000 model that had been used since the motion picture. And Associates and Farron spent 6 weeks repainting and repairing the model. Bran Farron was way in over his head and was simply incapable of delivering the special effects that Shatner wanted. Shatner wanted the final scene to be an all-out battle where the crew of the Enterprise would fight an army of angels and demons in a hell-like alien landscape, and this would have required next-level special effects that may have even stretched ILM's abilities. Well, for Bran Farron, there was simply no way. William Shatner described his plan to have a horde of gargoyles first attack the crew, and they would be repelled off by lasers. The second wave would be an army of rock monsters. Well, unfortunately, there was no way to do the gargoyles, so that had to be abandoned. And as for the rock monsters, Farron thought they can actually build that costume. Well, Shatner wanted to have 10 rock monsters, but Paramount said he could only have 1. So he went back and asked for 6 rock monsters, and Paramount said he could only have 1. William Shatner had to settle for 1 rock monster, and 1 Rockman outfit cost $350,000. And you can see from the test footage that it looked pretty silly. It had an animatronic face where the facial muscles and eyebrows made of styrofoam rock would move and look sinister. However, the eyes looked funny and made the rock monster look goofy. Furthermore, the technicians blew cigarette smoke into the outfit to cause smoke to leak out of the suit, thus creating a smoke effect in order to conceal the latex foam. And after filming the monster in the California desert, William Shatner did not like how the rock monster looked. He did not have the money to reshoot the footage, and he had to drop the idea of the Rockman and settle for a floating cartoon head of God. However, after filming the CGI sequences of the amorphous floating head of God, William Shatner and Bran Farron looked at the footage and they were not pleased. Shatner wanted to redo the CGI and approached Paramount for more money. However, Paramount wanted to cut their losses and denied the request. The footage you see on film was the graphics that Shatner did not like and wanted to reshoot. Now, unfortunately, he had to use it in the final cut of the movie. The scene in Galaxy Quest where Jason Nisbet fights a rock monster is said to be rumored to be an homage to William Shatner's failed concept. The Paramount executives were worried about the production and had an emergency meeting to consider removing William Shatner as the director. They telephoned Nicholas Meyer and asked him if he would be interested in coming in and directing the rest of Star Trek V. However, Nicholas Meyer passed on directing. Ultimately, Paramount decided to keep William Shatner, but refused any requests for more money. Paramount was just trying to cut their losses at this point. Fact number 10, William Shatner's final cut of the film was a complete mess. After completion of principal photography, William Shatner went to work on editing and produced his final cut of the movie in record time. He turned in his final cut to Harve Bennett and his team.
What?
And Harve Bennett and Ralph Winter were a little worried because it really wasn't possible to edit a movie that fast. Well, Bennett's fears were completely justified because the version Shatner turned in was a complete mess. The cut did not make any sense and could not be followed narratively. The special effects looked terrible, and the producers assumed they were seeing special effects test footage, and they were horrified to learn that the special effects they were given was indeed the final product. Harve Bennett knew they were in trouble. So their first solution was to hire famed music composer Jerry Goldsmith, who had composed Star Trek the Motion Picture, and they hoped an excellent score might help the movie. And Jerry Goldsmith turned in an incredible score, and many fans feel that the music in Star Trek V may be the best score among all the Star Trek movies. However, it did not help the story. So Harve Bennett completely re-edited the movie by himself. He had to completely rework the movie and even added a few scenes. One added scene was on the Klingon Bird of Prey, where it is revealed to Kirk that Spock was the gunner who saved him. This was in the original cut of the story and in the first draft of the script, but it didn't make any sense how Spock got on the Klingon Bird of Prey.
Please, Captain. Not in front of the Klingons.
So Harve Bennett added a scene where we see the Klingon ambassador tell Claw to apologize to Kirk.
I apologize.
And this would show that the Klingon ambassador still had some power and that it was likely he who engineered the temporary peace between the Enterprise and the Klingons and got Spock on the Bird of Prey. To Harve Bennett's credit, he was able to edit the film into a coherent narrative that we saw on the big screen. Bonus fact, the movie was a profitable disappointment. Everyone at Paramount knew they had a very weak movie and held their breath on opening weekend. The movie had a budget of $33 million, which was 50% more than the $21 million of the previous Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Well, to everyone's surprise, Star Trek V did very well on opening weekend, making $17.3 million, and it even beat The Voyage Home's opening weekend. However, like all critically panned movies, it had a sharp 59% drop in its second week, and then went on to have the shortest wide release of any of the previous Star Trek films. Now that said, Star Trek V did have a lot of competition at the cinema. The summer blockbuster season of 1989 was incredibly dense. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier had to compete with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Ghostbusters 2, Lethal Weapon 2, James Bond's License to Kill, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, When Harry Met Sally, and the blockbuster behemoth that was known as Tim Burton's 1989 film, Batman. In the end, it only made $49 million domestically and $63 million worldwide, barely recouping its $33 million budget. And VHS sales would make it solidly profitable. But it was considered the biggest box office disappointment of the year. And meanwhile, the negative reviews kept pouring in. Most critics thought it was bad, while some critics called it mediocre at best. Some liked the humor, while others found it inconsistent. And most agreed it was a disappointment. As a final insult, this movie is the only Star Trek film to be nominated for a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Picture, which it actually won. And in the end, The Final Frontier was labeled a commercial and critical failure. And for a while, it looked like Star Trek V had just killed the entire franchise on film. Fortunately, Paramount executives did not want to end Star Trek on this movie, and they felt they had to make one more movie in order to cleanse the palate of this film. Star Trek VI would close the franchise, but that is another story. That ends this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.